Hi, this is Ginny and Vivek. And Vivek and I have embarked on a podcast series to talk about all things coaching, executive coaching, leadership coaching pertaining to the Indian corporate context. Between Vivek and I, we have 30 years of coaching experience within corporate India. And today's topic uh, is about leadership coaching. And, I think what's important to say is about what Vivek and I are attempting to do here. In our previous two podcasts, and now in this one, I think our aim, our attempt is to get underneath the the noise that's there in the coaching community, coaching arena, underneath the labels, underneath the myths, underneath all of that. What is the essence of what we are really doing here? So to sort of demystify, but at the same time, not lose the philosophy and the depth of what we do, but to get underneath the labels and the languaging and name what is at the essence of this profession of coaching. And we do that through different topics, through different lenses. And today's topic is leadership coaching. Vivek, you want to say more about our topic today?
Yeah, so hello everyone. And like Jenny said, we're trying to um, separate the essence from the noise and the myth. And what we leverage in doing this is our practical work experience in corporate India. So there is a great amount of myth making around what is senior leadership coaching. And we decided to bring to attention that as a topic and see what is relevant that we can bring to our audience on the topic of senior leadership. So to kick it off, obviously Ginny and I have had some discussions in planning for this episode, and what we want to begin with is to try and define what is leadership coaching, senior leadership coaching. And I think a useful way to get at that is to perhaps start by naming what is not senior leadership coaching the way we see it. So in the corporate marketplace, I'm going to start by naming two types of uh, coaching offerings which we don't see as senior leadership coaching. So the first of that is what can be labeled as management functional coaching. It also comes under the umbrella of performance coaching nowadays. What it essentially means is that corporates nominate employees where they see that certain management area, something which is functional to the way that employee goes about doing their work, uh, can get better. Their performance can improve as a result of that coaching intervention around that functional area. Now, this functional area could be from a broad array of topics which most senior executives, deal with in their ongoing life as mid managers. And I'm saying mid managers because this type of coaching offering is mainly targeted at the mid management level. So, the array of topics can be managing peer relationships, uh, working well with people in authority, being assertive and improving one's communication, those sort of functional areas which lead to better performance at a mid-management level. So that's, one large area of coaching offering. The second prominent area of coaching offering, which is there, but we're not equating that to senior leadership coaching, is the area which actually it's business consulting, but it gets offered in the packaging of business coaching. So, what are some things which come under this label? It could be a whole host of topics which any top management executive has to deal with in running their business. It could be how to improve their P&L, bottom line. It could be how do they launch a new product into a new marketplace. It could be how do they structure new HR practices or hire the right kind of people for their organization. Classic organizational issues. And of course, there's great value in that. And there are people who have good skill in these areas, or else, they've themselves been top executives in various companies, and now they, offer coaching as their next career step around these topics. Now, yes, this has great value, but it isn't strictly coaching. Like we said, this is consulting. So, the work Ginny and I do, that isn't business consulting. We do senior leadership coaching. So, in the way we see it, in the practical experience we have in the corporate space, this is not what we're qualifying as senior leadership coaching. So I've said a bunch of things, Ginny. What would you add to all of this?
I think the only other qualifying thing that came up for me, Vivek, as I was listening to you, was that there are a lot of other ways that coaching is distinguished in the market. So, coaching is also distinguished not based on uh, these different aspects of leadership, but coaching is also distinguished based on the approach of coaching. This is transformational coaching. This is purpose coaching. This is, executive presence coaching. So there are many, what I'm just trying to point out is there are many labels to coaching. And all those are applicable to different levels in the corporate world as well. But again, this is part of going underneath it all and saying largely from 30,000 feet, these are the broad categories. This is sort of that really zoomed out view of these are the broad categories, notwithstanding different types of coaching based on different approaches, different philosophical traditions, different methodologies, so on and so forth. So that's the only clarifying thing that I thought I'd add to this.
No, yeah, that's useful. So I think many times the coaching offering gets labeled by the process, that particular coach may be following. Like you said, transformative coaching. Maybe that's a process they follow.
Yeah.
So, what we're doing is we're trying to arrive at the response to what is senior leadership coaching by eliminating what it is not. That's all we're doing.
Yeah. Well said, Vivek.
Yeah. So if we've eliminated the functional type of coaching which happens at mid-management level, and if we've eliminated what is business consulting, which sort of gets packaged as business coaching, then, Jenny, what is senior leadership coaching? How do we start arriving at a response to that if it is not these two categories?
Yeah. I think, Vivek, to put it again, to capture the first principles, using first principles as a way of understanding what is senior leadership coaching. And to put it very simply, would be to say that senior leadership coaching is where leaders at these senior levels have made a jump, a huge shift from life that is characterized by certainty to leadership life that is characterized by immense ambiguity. So I think a good way to look at senior leadership coaching or just senior leadership is that it's defined by the enormity, the breadth, the depth, the expanse of the ambiguity that senior leaders find themselves living in. Would you like to speak to that, Vivek?
Yeah, so in our discussions, what became obvious to us that if we were to name one single overarching defining characteristic of what is the experience of a senior leader different from, let's say, a mid-management executive. That single defining characteristic is that they operate in the middle of much larger ambiguity and much less certainty. So this ambiguity can be, um, it can start to look like ongoing changes in what outcomes they might be targeting, ongoing changes in what is happening in the internal dynamics of the company itself, ongoing changes also, I guess, in their own perception of how they themselves are doing. There's a
Mm.
lack of certainty, lack of surety even in that,
Mm.
which I think at a mid-management level, there's much stronger and sort of, firmer sense of what I have to do, what I have to deliver, how am I doing, how am I going about doing this. Much of that starts to evaporate and become hard to grasp at firmly at a senior leadership level.
I think, Vivek, I'd like to contextualize it further by adding the external environment that companies find themselves in. You know, yes, we've talked about when this sort of the startup world was has been at its most expansive. We've talked about disruption. Disruption was a word that has been commonly used in the corporate world. But with the advent of AI, with the political shifts, with the climate change shifts, with the geopolitical shifts, with the sociological shifts, I mean, even if you look at the external environment that companies find themselves in, it's not an environment of certainty. It itself is an environment of immense ambiguity. And I think the metaphor that comes to my mind is the metaphor of shifting sands, an ever changing landscape. And it's not like one thing is stable. Everything on every vector is moving. And senior leaders find themselves at the confluence of all these shifting narratives, shifting landscapes, both internal landscape and external landscapes.
Right.
And I think, Vivek, I'm wondering that if this is the condition of senior leadership, then what form, what um, is um, the word that comes to mind is mandate. What is then the mandate of leadership coaching? What do we then do in leadership coaching if this is where senior leaders find themselves? And this is the defining feature that distinguishes them from the rest of the organization.
Yeah, yeah. So if they're shifting sands and there are multiple vectors, um, you know, packaged, pre-packaged solutions don't work. So as coaches for senior leaders, if we're coming with a sense that, hey, we figured something out, we have a ready-made solution for your problem, and here it is, and go run with it, that is not valid. It doesn't work. It is not what is called for. Um, what is called for instead is because there is such ambiguity and shifting stance, we want to name a sort of a two-step process that we've been able to see as a pattern in the work that we've done with senior leaders, where some value gets created. And that two-step pattern is one, sense making, and second, decision making.
Mm.
Because there's such great vectors going in all sorts of directions and pulling that senior leader, in various ways, it is important to become more competent as somebody who makes sense of all this.
Mm.
And second, because these are leaders, they have to take decisions despite the ambiguity.
Yeah.
Business has to happen. So, greater competence in decision making is also necessary. So, we want to talk about these two, sense making and decision making, in some more detail to talk about how coaching becomes relevant for a senior leader who is senior because they have learned a lot of things about how to do well. They're
Mm.
not at a beginner or mid level where they need step by step directional kind of intervention. That doesn't work. What works is their own greater competence in sense making and decision making.
The place where I'd like to come in and sort of almost double click on is, Vivek, what you said a few minutes ago about we have arrived at these not from the textbooks that we've read on coaching, that these this framework, broad, very loosely held framework, this tentative framework of two essential things that are happening in leadership coaching from our own experience. This isn't from textbook. This isn't from, the training we've had. This is us now arriving at these from our own lived experience of being in many, many, many coaching conversations with senior leaders. And then when we have looked back at our coaching experience, then we've been able to see that actually, irrespective of the frameworks, irrespective of the processes we may have learned, irrespective of the step-by-step formula that we may have been trained in. What actually happens in leadership coaching is that as coaches, we are helping leaders with sense making. And from that sense making, we are helping them with decision making. And we'll speak both about decision making. This decision making is not meant in its traditional sense of decision making. We'll speak more about what we mean by decision making here. But Vivek, you want to talk more about what this sense making is, what we mean
Yeah,
by sense.
how you just described, how we've arrived at this is a good way to understand sense making. So,
Mm,
there is textbook knowledge, there are things that people learn along the way, but, we've sort of come to realize that at the level of senior leadership, it is important to see what their situation and world is for what it is, as opposed to imposing our pre-existing, pre-framed ways of looking at their world.
mm,
So in sense making, it is terribly, terribly important to, just like in a map, you need coordinates.
mm,
Like there's x-axis and y-axis in a very sort of classroom, high school style map.
mm,
You have to figure out what is your x-axis, what is your y-axis, which vector is going in which direction. So similarly, for that senior leader to gain greater competence in starting to name accurately and relevantly
mm,
what are the axes they are in the middle of.
mm.
That's the very useful way to deal with the ambiguity.
Yeah.
Ambiguity starts to become less overwhelming if we can see more, um, both intelligently and sharply, what is it that really matters in trying to lessen the chaos of it.
Yeah.
And that is in the naming of it in a powerful way.
Yeah. And I guess the question we are really answering is, what am I in the midst of?
Yeah, yeah.
What is it that in this moment I am in the midst of? And I think, Vivek, I'd say what you said a bit differently. Those another word for those coordinates, for those vectors, for that x-axis, y-axis might be, what are the polarities that I am navigating here? Um what are the contradictions that we are trying to address and solve? What are the various pushes and pulls here? Um, where is the cultural flow? Where is my personal flow in that? In what ways are they consonant? In where is there no resonance? Where do I find resonance? It's a skill in um, it's a skill in locating oneself amidst various forces that are at play. And like you said very nicely, to name that, because it's in the naming of it that we can go beyond the overwhelm and into the space of creativity.
Yeah. Yeah. So also, just to do some more sense making of what we're saying, it's not like we come in and tell that leader, here's how you should name it.
Yeah.
Uh, where I think our competence is in enabling that kind of conversation with
Mm,
the attention shifts to how can I start to extract what really matters in the middle of all this ambiguity? And how can I start then to name it in a way that creates more meaning for me, creates
absolutely.
more sense for me? So,
Absolutely.
so you use this word polarity. I think if you use an example, perhaps, it'll shine out more.
Before I name the examples, Vivek, something just came up for me, and I feel strongly to sort of want to voice that first, which is that, you know, in our growth and development as coaches, uh, what we've had to work on is to uh, overcome our own meaning of what it means to be valuable and useful to leaders. It's um, it's very common and natural and understandable for coaches to feel that they need to do the naming. And when the leader is showing up with that overwhelm, and we don't mean overwhelm that leader saying, "Oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do." Not that kind of. It's a very felt sense of, I have all this going on around me. I have my people saying this. This is where I find myself in the industry. This is what's happening in my personal life. I find myself amidst all of this. And as
There's
coaches,
no,
there's just
there's
this,
no solid ground.
there's no solid ground that I'm standing on. That's what we mean by overwhelm. And as coaches, we feel, oh, as this person's coach, I need to reduce the level of overwhelm. I need to give them a formula to rid themselves of the weight of this. Uh, and what you said is actually exactly the opposite of that. That we are not coming in to do that rescuing. We are not coming in to necessarily take away that overwhelm, to reduce it, to take the burden away by,
And
yeah,
also not to consult and provide some expertise on how they can solve their problems. It's
exactly.
not even
We don't have that. But it
yeah.
is in enabling that conversation. And I think it was worth repeating, Vivek, from
Yeah.
this lens, that we are enabling the leaders to be in a conversation where they can begin to name the vectors and the forces that are at play. And coming to, the examples of some of the polarities, I think one again, Vivek, getting to first principles, getting to the essence across a lot of my coaching work with leaders. One fundamental polarity I see them navigating or be at the confluence of is the polarity of their idealism versus their pragmatism. That's one sort of fundamental polarity that we see leaders finding themselves in the midst of. Idealism is my vision for my company, for my people, for myself. Idealism is what I wish for, what I wish to
Yeah.
see. You
It's
know,
the perfect word.
it's the perfect world. It's where things are great. And then the pragmatism is what's the reality? What is the reality needing you to see and confront and work through? And sometimes, Vivek, in common parlance, we might say that this is the time where leaders find themselves um, at crossroads of conflicting values. I value freedom. I value giving my people autonomy, giving my people, the independence. But I also value control. Idealism requires that I give freedom, autonomy, independence to my people. But somewhere pragmatism also requires me to control the process, to exert some form of control, to hold the conversation for accountability.
Yeah.
So this is sort of one polarity that Vivek I see, which is at play. Anything else comes to mind, or you want to speak more to this polarity?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, what we're doing by this example is illustrating one common and significant example of how leaders get stuck in the middle of these opposing forces, seemingly opposing forces, like control and freedom or idealism and pragmatism. And so, by definition, polarity, what it implies is that it's not like one pole is better than the other pole, or there's a good pole and a bad pole. That's not what it means. It's just that there are two different ways of understanding what is going on, and they interplay with each other.
Beautifully said.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's value to idealism, there is value to pragmatism, and sometimes leaders get stuck on one side of it
Yeah.
without actually clearly articulating for themselves that that's how they're stuck.
Hmm.
And that's where, the naming of it, that this is what you're at the middle of, this is where you're locating yourself, is the sense making.
Absolutely. Vivek, as I was listening to you, I was remembering a coaching conversation I had last week. And, the leader so beautifully said, it was so poignant that moment that, Ginny, I'm stuck between a yes and a no.
Mm.
The poll was, what does a yes look like here? What does a no look like here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe some leaders, maybe not that particular leader, might see no as a bad pole,
Yes.
which isn't what is always.
Exactly why I wanted to give this example.
Yeah.
That in this
Yeah.
particular leader's case, the learning was, what do I need to say no to? I'm so overwhelmed. I have bandwidth issues. I say yes to everything because I think even this is important, even this is important, even this is important. I need to be there in this meeting. I need to help customers with this. I need to help my people with this. I need to represent the company. I need to be everywhere at all times. That was what the leader was contending with and was stuck at the yes pole. And
Yeah.
as the leader named it and began to ask, okay, what would the movement towards the no pole look like? And that's
Yeah.
where we are entering the sort of the decision making part of it. But just to give more color to this aspect of
Right.
polarities and what it takes to help leaders name that and what
Yeah.
becomes possible as a result of naming it. I just wanted to
Yeah.
give an example.
Yeah. Yeah. So um, by naming it, it changes the perspective, the frame with which the situation is being approached, and that can enable a very different outcome then, as
Yeah.
opposed to what the starting point might have been.
Yeah.
And so polarity, the way the examples we've used may sound like, how someone can get stuck in the thinking process, but
Mm,
that's not the only form of ambiguity or stuckness.
mm,
What we also see is stuckness or dissonance. Dissonance means, there seems to be a gap or a difference.
mm,
We see that there is dissonance sometimes in what people are claiming, what they're saying, as opposed to how they actually end up behaving or showing up.
mm,
So, just like a snappy example can be that, some senior leader in their way of articulating seem extremely worried about some situation. That sense of worry is very obvious in the way they talk about it. But then week after week, month after month, in how they go about doing their business, the worry doesn't translate to any relevant real action.
mm.
There's a dissonance there.
Nice. Yeah, nice.
The dissonance can also be in, like to give a maybe a example from some recent work. Yeah, so this person I was coaching, he was talking about what he's going through, and it got me worried. But I didn't sense an adequate degree of worry in their articulation of what they were saying.
Mm,
That's dissonance.
yeah,
So, whether it's how what people say, what people feel emotionally, what they behave, and what is the coach's response to all of that, there can be dissonance in between of all of that.
yeah,
And that's also really important from a naming perspective.
absolutely. And Vivek, what this brings up for me is, how in the when we were talking about polarities, we were talking about what coaches need to work on is overcome their own need for being useful and actually let the leaders themselves articulate what forces they are amidst of rather than quickly rushing to rescue them from the overwhelm or from the stress that they're experiencing. In the same way, I think under this umbrella of the dissonance discussion we've been having, I think what the skill that coaches need is the skill of attunement. Had you not been attuned, you wouldn't have known that what is being said is worry, but what is being experienced is not that much worry, and that required you to be attuned enough to see what is the dissonance between what is being said vis-a-vis what is being felt, which would have which you notice through being in attunement with uh, our clients, our leaders. One example that came up for me as I was listening to you was, I was coaching a leader who was talking about some new initiative being launched, and I asked, "How are you feeling?" And the leader said, "Yeah, I'm really glad. I'm really happy about this finally happening." And yet, in their body language and in the way they said, I'm really glad, I'm happy," there was no sense of real being glad and being
It
happy.
wasn't adding up.
Yeah, it wasn't adding
Yeah.
up. And it was sort of when I reflected back, that the leader could begin to articulate their ambivalence about the new initiative and their real sense of worry about whether it will be successful or not. So it
Yeah.
was in some ways noticing that dissonance and articulating that dissonance comes from how attuned we are to our coaches, our clients, um, but also then from naming it, from reflecting it back as a data point,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
something
Very much.
that leaders can reflect on, and it allows the room for a real conversation to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, like we said, the skill the coach brings is to enable such a conversation, to make it real. And also another really important skill is determining which sort of such dissonance to point out.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there can be multiple, and that can take the conversation in all sorts of directions.
Yeah.
But to make the active choice that, hey, I think this is the one to name because that's where most potential is for some, better outcome.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
Ab-
that is attunement, the word you used earlier.
yeah. I think, Vivek, we've sufficiently covered the whole aspect of sense making. What would moving on to the decision making aspect of our framework? What might you say about that?
Yeah, so like we just sort of touched upon it, that in the naming itself, that changes the landscape, and hence, something fresh, something new, something more relevant starts to emerge. So the
Hmm.
naming itself, the sense making itself, uh, opens the doors to sort of a more powerful decision making.
Hmm.
But just like the first statement would be to make, which is now, I think, sort of popular knowledge, the way it's said that what got you here won't get you, to your next thing.
Yeah.
Um, and essentially, what it means is that you have to step aside some traditional, typical, habitual ways of showing up as a leader and to, become willing and creative to see, what else is more potential, what else has more power to move my own agenda forward. That supports the new decision making.
Yeah. I would say the same thing a little bit differently, Vivek. I really liked the use of the word habitual. Um, I, I think what we're really saying is when we do sense making like this, in the way that we're describing, to partner with the leaders and do sense making in this sort of way. What we are essentially doing is, um, you know, breaking the patterns of how they usually make decisions,
Hmm.
right? They would have habituated themselves to make decisions using those one or two considerations that they've had in the past to make those decisions.
Yeah, so
Whereas,
maybe somebody leans more on control as opposed to freedom. Or maybe
exactly,
somebody leans more on idealism. It could
yes,
be any of that. So
yes,
it's realizing that.
yeah, exactly. Maybe somebody leans more towards saying more and more yeses, you know,
Sure.
and reaching a point of burnout and then sort of restarting and resetting, but again following the same pattern of decision making. I need to say yes to everything, I need to be everywhere, but this way of sense making, which shows, which illuminates that there are other choices here, there
Hmm.
are other vectors here that, given your worldview, right now you're not seeing. But this way of sense making just makes sure that the diversity of the vectors at play are in the field of consciousness for the leader. It's in the field of awareness of the leader now. And when you
Yeah.
have that field with more of that identified, it's more nuanced. The field is more nuanced. The field is more there's more variation. There are more contours here. And therefore, you don't have to keep going up the same path up to the top of the mountain. When you expose the field in that way, more
Yeah.
other paths to reach the top can begin to emerge. And that
Yeah.
emergence almost happens on its own. It's not something that the coach manufactures or the coach wills it into being. The coach does no such thing. I think it's within that sense making, within that exposition of, let's look at what is at play here. Let's look at what are the polarities. Let's look at what is the dissonance here. In doing that, we make the richness of the awareness of field quite vibrant, quite alive. And through that,
Hmm.
new other ways, more creative ways of decision making begin to emerge. What do you make of that, Vivek?
Yeah, so I want to highlight this one word which got used, emergence.
Hmm.
Um, so, like we said earlier, this sort of what got you here won't get you to the next thing it's fairly popular. Most people have heard about it, but emergence is a new word. So
Hmm.
why don't we dwell on that a little bit longer uh, to bring out its fuller sense of meaning. So like you were saying, emergence implies something new is coming forth.
Hmm.
Um, and this, what is new, couldn't have been predicted.
Yeah,
So, in how we've gotten to, for example, this episode we're doing, when we started preparing for it a few weeks ago, we didn't know this is the shape it will take.
absolutely.
You
Yeah,
know, we stayed in the process of, our creativity, our curiosity, our applying it, both in a way of, both from the sense of idealism and pragmatism to try and shape where it's going. And then it takes a certain shape which emerges. So I think that is key in what we enable as coaches with senior leaders is to encourage and hold the attention and space for that emergence.
absolutely.
And then attention means to bring the senior leaders attention to what is emerging now,
Yeah,
which wasn't even available before.
yeah. And Vivek, I think what's really important, what came up for me was uh, part of this process, and it came up for me when you were talking about our process of getting to this conversation, is that uh, we both had to be comfortable with frustration. Creative process can be frustrating because there are no predicted easy answers. And like we said at the beginning, that this is really a move for leaders, this is a move from certainty to ambiguity. Part of being with ambiguity, part of developing um, a, a, a more fruitful, a more resourceful relationship with ambiguity. Part of that is learning to be with our frustration, learning to withstand that frustration. Because if we don't learn to withstand that frustration, our easy out is the familiar patterns of decision making.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so part of this being with what is emerging, we can't let it fully emerge if we cut short that and go to our familiar ways of resolving our conundrums, resolving our issues. Part of that is that we stay with the frustration of not knowing the answers, of not knowing the way. And the
Yeah,
more the leader develops the capacity to hold that frustration, to be with that ambiguity, the more something new can be allowed to emerge.
right, right. So just sort of to put it to sort of say it in a summary format, what we've said so far is that there's ambiguity, and to deal with that ambiguity, sense making and decision making are the two key steps.
Mm.
We've talked in some detail about sense making, and we're talking about decision making for now. And for decision making, we're saying is what we said so far is that it's important to step away from some habitual patterns and to see what else might be a more potential way of approaching. Then we're also saying that there is the phenomenon of emergence, what is new and fresh, and to allow it to emerge. And we're saying that it is necessary to be on to frustrations, etc., in that process. So let's zoom in more on frustrations. So in any leader's life, there's a great deal of up and down. There are ongoing, wins and sort of failures, or even complete failures.
Yeah.
And this impacts what the leader is feeling. There's frustration, there's hope, there's disappointment, and various other, in between feelings. Um, and for any such leader to become more competent, again, the refined attunement to what is the quality of the hope, or what is the nature of the disappointment or the frustration, is terribly important.
Mm.
To just, make a blanket statement that we're hopeful today, as opposed to, something more nuanced around, um, like I think in just one of our previous conversations, you'd use the phrase final sense of loss
Mm.
around a certain topic.
Mm.
And that kind of languaging
Mm.
more clearly and in a very potent way brings out the the fabric of the disappointment.
Yeah.
And if one isn't grokking on that, then you're staying in the ambiguity. Our emotion help us determine some certainty in the middle of all this chaos.
Yeah. And if we don't, uh, if we don't step into this realm of uh, the leader's hope and disappointment, then in this whole sense making process, we may have ignored the emotionality that is key to the whole sense making piece. You know,
Yeah,
um, and I think staying true to our intention of naming the essence, perhaps all the emotions that we can think of, happiness, being glad, being loss, and grief, and if you take the whole range of emotions, perhaps the essence of it is our hopes and our disappointments. And so I think it's if we ignore the leader's emotional world around all of this, the polarities that are at play, the dissonance that's at play, then we've missed an important component of the sense making process. We've missed an important component of the decision making process. And, I think it's a great disservice that we perpetuate in the corporate world when we keep privileging being rational over being emotional. I hear it so much in the corporate world when they say, "Oh, you're being emotional about this. Can you just be objective and rational about it?" But the arena of leadership coaching is where we give up that uh, corporate mandate of privileging objective and being rational towards actually fully stepping into um, our hopes and disappointments, the leader's hope and disappointments through this. Because if the leader is learning to step away from the habitual, from the patterned way of being, then there is some sense of loss. There is something that you are giving up and stepping into the new. It's going to come with its own hope and disappointment.
yeah,
And I think it's really important for the leader to step into that and for coaches to assist and support the leaders in stepping into their lived experience of hope and disappointment.
yeah, yeah. So, while you were speaking, I think just to illustrate this with an example, this one client of mine, and it's ongoing work with him. He's working on his credibility.
Mm,
In some ways, his credibility has been at stake.
mm,
And there are many ways to approach the topic intellectually, but when it got labeled in the tones of shame and honor,
mm,
it really hit home.
mm,
What are, behaviors or situations where he detects his shame as opposed to a sense of honor? And how can that start to shift by more, potent understanding of the situation, and then some, emerging new way of approaching it
mm,
became, the work he is doing.
mm,
So, so, and that's again, it's linked to becoming more hopeful that I can reclaim my credibility and be in a place of greater honor ultimately.
Yeah. Wow. That's quite a poignant example, Vivek. Both shame and honor are like I was getting goosebumps when you named that polarity. It's actually not even a polarity. I think it's more uh, the,
It's a lived situation as leaders,
yeah,
it is bound to be in that, in living that life. It is a necessary experience.
yes, yes, absolutely.
So I think what you were saying is that earlier that we shouldn't shy away from this.
Hmm.
There is such rich work and potential in bringing in the emotional. It is like the z-axis, the z-axis. So there's x and y, but if you ignore the z-axis, you're sort of lost the plot.
Absolutely, Vivek. I think, it is so so easy to work with just credibility, right? Like, okay, what's your plan of action? How are you going to build more credibility? Who are your
Right.
stakeholders? Who do you need to have conversations with? How are you going to make that happen? But when credibility is broken down into the real experience of shame and honor, I think it's a very confronting experience. It would have made for a very confronting experience, but it would have allowed the leader to um, truly name what it is that's at play for them emotionally. And when you do that kind of naming, I think, like we said before, something emerges. And when you're naming it, it's frustrating, it's disappointing, it's confronting, it's going to throw up everything. And I can't imagine, Vivek, that a leader won't want to, in that moment of being confronted, um, descend back to habituated patterns because it's a defense mechanism that I don't want to confront this. And it takes something on the coach's part in that moment to have the leader stay in that conversation and to
Yeah.
truly name that that's what I am contending with here. That
Yeah.
that's the axis on which I am truly locating myself. And
Yeah.
and from that conversation, now, I mean, it's almost like I can feel it at a very lived level for myself that from that conversation, the conversation of credibility has just a whole new meaning. And
Right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
It's not just about will I be able to have a 2x growth in the next 6 months. The flavor changes completely.
totally, totally, totally. Um, yeah,
So just to move it forward, we're sort of talking about how what this can open up and the potential it has. But I think it'll be useful to also contrast all of what we're saying with the more sort of traditional way of approaching senior leadership we've seen in the marketplace, which is, around the work done with values and goals and vision, that sort of work.
yeah,
Um, how would you begin to, compare and contrast?
yeah. I think I'd like to say that, this used to be my uh, dominant way of leadership coaching, uh, which was to help the leader articulate their values and help them live those values to the fullest. To put very simplistically, leadership coaching meant that the leader is working on what's going to be their legacy, what are their true values, what is their true purpose, to help them articulate that inspired sense of purpose and to help them articulate their values. And then through coaching work, help them see how they can truly live according to those values. Um, and of course, through experience, more study, more understanding, also one's own life experience. As a coach, I've come to realize that that's a very small part of leadership coaching. And I'd go as far as to say that that is actually that is not leadership coaching. I think I'm saying something very strong, but I just want to complete that by saying, actually, in leadership coaching, we do the work on values, we do the work on purpose, but not so much as what it is, but more to do with in what ways do my values need to evolve from what they have been. In what ways do I need to reconsider the purpose with which I have been leading? And it's more an evolution, it's more a confrontation to the leader about the values they've held. What is the cost of holding those values? What does holding those values really mean? What it does to the leader, what it does to the organization, and therefore then in what ways do we need to evolve those values?
Yeah.
That's what I'd say, Vivek. Do you want to weigh in? Do you want to come in here?
I think values, purpose, vision, etc. I think it has usage from a discovery perspective.
Hmm.
Can we start to, figure out who you are, what you're in the middle of by naming a couple of values
Yeah.
or getting some sense of, what your long-term vision is. But often it turns into a static exercise, which means that it's been named once and then, that is what it is.
Yeah.
But given what we've, said about both ambiguity and emergence,
Hmm.
if those are the two critical defining um, ways to characterize senior leadership, then this sort of static naming has no bang
No,
other than just like a first level discovery process.
I like that. Yeah.
And also, I think what ends up happening, despite good intent, is that people name both the vision, etc., and the values in a sort of a grandiose way, like, some big, beautiful. I'm sounding like Trump now, big, beautiful. But that's how it is, There's a bit of grandiosity to it,
Yeah.
which which is performative, It's sort of, if I don't make it, that grand, then maybe it's not enough.
Yeah.
But what we're saying is that one has to meet life where it is in the middle of all that shifting stance.
Yeah.
Grandiosity doesn't help.
Yeah. The only thing I'd like, very, very beautifully said, Vivek, and I think the reason we are laughing is because, humor is sometimes a better way of understanding reality. And that's the reality of leadership coaching sometimes, that we just enter the world of grandiosity. And I think just talking about values is not only just an exercise in discovery, and it's useful as an exercise in discovery, but I think it's also remaining very cognitive, and I think from our experience, Vivek, both of us have talked about this, that um, at leadership coaching, we are talking about bringing to fore different aspects of what it means to be human. And that requires both working at the cognitive level, at the emotional level, sometimes the bodily level, the felt sense level. So I think that wholesomeness that senior leadership coaching requires, I think we compromise on that wholesomeness if we just stay in
Yeah.
the values domain, because it can be a very sort of cognitive exercise.
Yeah,
Uh,
it turns into that like a placard, with those five named values which sits at one corner of the desk or somewhere framed on the wall, and
yes.
that's where it decides them forever after.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, Vivek, just to say sort of, we talked about dissonance. And I think more than naming the values and living your values, I think a coach's role might be to see what's the difference between the espoused values and the lived values. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. That's a big area of dissonance. Yes.
yeah, like I espouse to be this kind of a leader, but I'm living in this way. And I think it behooves coaches to be able to see where the dissonance is in the espoused values and the lived values, and to reflect that back to the leader.
Yeah. Yeah, and that again links to the polarity of idealism, pragmatism. Many coaches, I think even we've in the past, I think, remained in the zone of idealism, in naming such values, right?
Yeah, yeah, I
And I
have.
think very familiar. Yeah,
I know I
absolutely.
have. I think it's a bias for me,
Yeah.
personally, as a coach. I think my thinking style is this inspired thinking style. So I have a bias towards sort of moving more into idealism. But
Mm.
as coaches, I guess it's important for us to have done that kind of self discovery ourselves, to see, what am I likely to show up with, and so that we can ourselves come out of our habituated ways that
Absolutely.
that we show up. Vivek, would
Yeah.
you like to bring this to a close? I think we've covered everything. Do you want to bring this to a close? How might we conclude this conversation?
Right. So, so we started out by trying to define our understanding of what is senior leadership coaching. And to address that, we've said that ambiguity is the key defining characteristic. And what we bring as coaches to deal with that kind of ambiguity is working with the senior leader to become more competent in both sense making and decision making. Um, and this is very different from, I think most top leaders have access to all sorts of support. They have their therapists with whom they can, just open up their hearts, etc. They have their well-wishers, with whom they can bounce off ideas. They have experts to, get advice from. But what they don't have is someone who can be in the middle with all the ambiguity and help them get better at their own sense making. Um, what's your way to start, arriving at some concluding statements?
I really like, Vivek, the way you've sort of delineated our role in a very clear way. That we're not the sounding boards, we're not the therapists, we're not the advisors, but the real value that we provide through leadership coaching is helping leaders develop their capacity for sense making, and from that sense making, to develop their capacity not just for decision making. Like we said earlier, Vivek, these are highly competent leaders. They have come to this place of senior leadership having made critical decisions along the way, and that's how they've arrived. So I just sort of wanted to make sure that we're not just talking about your usual business decision making, that the real value we provide is helping leaders uh, make decisions that are courageous, and courageous not because of the boldness of the decision itself, because even that they are used to making. They would have made bold decisions. They would have changed approaches to market entry. They would have pivoted. They would have taken those bold decisions. But there's a specific kind of decision making, which is, I think, more around creativity that comes from overcoming the habituated ways of approaching and
Yeah.
breaking those habituated ways through this new way of sense making and arriving at decisions in a more creative way. And I think creativity is something that we don't talk about much in the corporate world, but this isn't about that artistic creativity, but it is about that artistic creativity. And I think that's the real value coaches can add through this kind of lens of leadership coaching that, develop the capacity for sense making, but also develop the capacity for this creative decision making.
Yeah, yeah, and all of that creative artistry and decision making leads into what we've labeled as emergence.
Yeah.
It is giving birth to that new sense of where one is and then to operate from there. So if that is happening again and again, then we've done a good job as coaches.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. I hope anybody listening has drawn some value from this conversation. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you for listening in. And there'll be information in the notes of how you can share your comments with us about this episode. Thank you.
Yeah.